Well, many of you have been participating in Steve Christiansen's classes for years, and they're always interesting. I tell people that Steve's an excellent teacher because he's a passionate student, and I think that's one of the keys to good teaching is to be passionate students and really dig into the topics. They're always good. This one just happened to be about as timely as you could get to look at the book of Job, given the situation we're in. And I'm glad too that it's going to start now. Just so you know, next Sunday, Stewardship Committee is actually part of the education worship. And so Andy Roberts will be doing this same adult ed time, but looking at budgeting for giving and looking at a little different name. Andy works for Chase Bank, so he's got background there, and to see him apply that then to faith and so on. But then Steve will come back 2 weeks from today and continue the study of Job, and the plan is to run this through November and December up until the Christmas time. There'll be one other Sunday. It'll be the Sunday of the Thanksgiving weekend where he won't be teaching specifically on Job, and we'll either have time just for fellowship or we'll see something else that Sunday. But that we don't have formal education during that last Sunday of November. It's the first Sunday of Advent, but it's Thanksgiving weekend. Anyway, really looking forward to it. And Steve, really appreciate you being willing to teach. Steve served on the adult ed team too the whole time I've been here. So been a real anchor for our adult education program. I appreciate that.
Thank you for the introduction.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about this, it's timely now, but I started thinking about this class about a year ago, and before everything just went down the drain, and so it was just by chance that it's so appropriate for this time. Today, I'm going to give an introduction to the book. We're not going to actually get into the text. We'll save that for 2 weeks from now. I'll just go through a background and summarize the story and give you a few facts about the book. I do have a priming the pump question. I usually rely on PowerPoint slides when I teach my classes. I'm trying Pastor Mark's outline method for this class, so we'll see how it goes. So I have a priming the pump question. Why do bad things happen to good people? Many people consult the book of Job to try to find the answer to that question, and they're usually disappointed. But I believe that phrase, why do bad things happen to good people, was the title of a book that was published many years ago. I have not read it, so if you have the advantage here. Does anybody want to add any thoughts about why bad things happen to good people?
I think that book was written by a Jewish rabbi, Steve.
Is that right?
Yes. It came out in the early 1980s.
Ah, okay. Well, it makes sense. Job, the book of Job was written in Hebrew, so I guess a Jewish rabbi would probably have some expertise in that area.
Well, I am a follower of process theology, which is a kind of theology that grows out of our discoveries in nuclear physics. And what we've discovered when we smash atoms together is that when we looked for smaller and smaller particles, we found out there are not smaller and smaller particles. You get down to a certain size particle, you smash them together, and what's underneath are not particles, but events. And process theology is a theology that's grown out of discussion of if events are what is real, what does that tell us about humanity and about God? And process theology says that God has all the power that is, but the power to stop a car accident or to cure someone of cancer is not a power that exists. So it's not a power that God has. And hence process theology says that God doesn't have the power to cause bad things to happen or stop bad things from happening. And the reason that bad things happen to good people is because the earth is unfolding and our human history is unfolding the way it unfolds in many random ways. And they happen because they just happen randomly, and God can't do anything about it. God suffers along with us and cries along with us, and God is not empowered to stop it from happening.
Fascinating. Process theology, you say?
Yeah.
I'm going to have to look that up. It sounds interesting.
I'm Andy. I like a lot of what you said. I never really thought about it as God can't or doesn't have the power to stop bad things from happening to good people. I sort of think of it the same way as, why do good things happen to bad people? And if we dwell on the fact that good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people, it's really a sad way of living life, I think. And I like to just think that things happen. Good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people, good things happen to bad people, our entire life is full of good and bad things that happen, whether we're good or bad people. And so I don't think that God is going to stop those things from happening, but he's going to definitely judge us on what we do after those things have happened.
Yeah, so it said that the rain falls on the just and the unjust. Yeah. Any other thoughts? If you have attended my classes in the past, you'll know I'm a big fan of consulting the experts. And I usually have some references. So this is no exception. I have 2 reference books that I'm reading. The first is, to give credit where credit is due, the first is called Job, A New Translation with Introduction and Commentary by Marvin H. Pope, professor of Northwest Semitic Languages at Yale. That book was published in 1965. The second, more recent book is Job, A New Translation by Edward L. Greenstein, professor emeritus of Bible at Bar Ilan University in Israel. So I'm going to be referring to those books. Now, in my outline, I don't footnote all of the things that came from those books. I'm just putting those references here at the top, so I didn't have to do that. But most of this information is coming from one of those 2 books. Oh, I should mention, almost forgot, this session is being recorded. I hope that doesn't inhibit discussion at all, but if you have a grand plan for robbing Fort Knox, you probably shouldn't mention it here. First, why do we speak of the patience of Job? It was interesting to read where that came from. The King James Version of the Bible, the book of James, chapter 5, verse 11, says, "You have heard of the patience of Job." Job was anything but patient. He railed against God and questioned why God was doing those things to him. He cursed the day he was born. "Let the day perish in which I was born. Why did I not die at birth?" He was wishing for that he had never been born. In comparison, if you consult any modern translation, look, for instance, at the New Revised Standard Version, you have heard of the endurance of Job. That's a much better translation, because Job had a lot of endurance, but not much patience. Let's look a little bit about the background of the book. The book of Job probably took its final form during the Persian period of Jewish history. The Persian period started in 538 BCE, when King Cyrus of Persia, having conquered the Babylonians, allowed the Jews who had been taken captive by the Babylonians to return to their homeland, those that wished to do so. Not all of them did so, but some of them did, and rebuilt Jerusalem and the temple. The Persian period lasted for roughly 200 years until Alexander the Great conquered Persia The Persian rule, the Persian dictatorship was fairly benign as compared to the Babylonian period that went before and under Alexander the Great and the Greek period that came after. Point 2 there, the prologue, which is chapters 1 and 2, and the epilogue, the last part of chapter 42, may have been part of an ancient folk tale. And toward the end, I'll get into some references of where the ideas in Job may have come from.
I have a question about the Persian period.
Yeah.
Are we talking about the Israelite people in the Israel area, or still in the Babylonian area?
There, some of them returned to their homeland in the area of Israel and rebuilt. Some of them stayed in the area of Babylon.
Were they all under the influence of Persia during that time?
Yes, that's correct. What was Israel under Persia became the Persian province of Yehud, and they were ruled by Persia. It was, as I said, a fairly benign rule, although they, of course, expected taxes to be paid. But it's interesting, the Persian philosophy was evidently to invest in areas that they had conquered. Quite different from some other conqueror nations.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. The book probably was not written by one person. Probably was written by more than one person at different times. Point 3, the Elohim Speeches, which are chapters 32 through 37, were probably added by a later editor. And I'll say more about that in a little bit. The prologue and epilogue are prose. Most of the rest of the book is poetry. A few words about Hebrew poetry. When we think of poetry in English, we probably think of meter and rhyme. Although there is such a thing as free verse poetry in English too, but we usually think of rhyming poetry. That's not Hebrew poetry. Hebrew poetry is about something called parallelism. There are many types of parallelism in Hebrew poetry. I have put a couple of types down here for examples. Point A, synonymous parallelism. An example from Deuteronomy: may my teaching drop like the rain, my speech condense like the dew. So the same thought is repeated using different words in the two parts of that line. There's antithetic parallelism, which makes the point by using opposites. For instance, Proverbs 10, a wise son delights a father, but a foolish son is a mother's grief. So there you've got the contrast between wise and foolish. There are many different types of parallelism. Many of the parables of Jesus, especially in the book of Luke, contain quite a bit of parallelism. I taught a class a number of years ago on the parables of Jesus in Luke. We examined some of the different types of parallelism. Just a brief example from one of the sayings of Jesus, one of the shorter sayings of Jesus. This is an example of something called chiastic parallelism. The Sabbath is made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. If you draw a line from the first line to the second line, connecting Sabbath in both lines, and then connecting humankind in both lines, you'll see it makes an X. The Greek letter that looks like an X is chi. That's why that is called chiastic parallelism. So that's what we're looking for in the poetic parts of the book of Job, is various types of parallelism. Although one of the authors of these books makes the point that antithetic parallelism doesn't appear much in the book of Job. Let's get into the characters. Characters, of course, are one of the characters, of course, is Job, a righteous man with a wife and 10 children. And he's quite wealthy. He owns sheep and cattle and land, and he's quite prosperous at the beginning of the story. Point two, his friends, and I have the friends in quotation marks because those friends turn out to be useless in Job's examination of why these things the bad things are happening to him. But Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar are his 3 friends, and they have a dialogue with Job in which they are of essentially no help at all.
May I ask a question, please?
Yes.
Why 10 children? I know that numbers are significant. 12
Yes.
children would be, the 12 tribes of Israel. 7 would be the 7 days of the week. Why 10 children?
Yes. 7 boys and 3 girls. There are the magic numbers for you. 3 and 7 are also special numbers in Hebrew theology. So the 10 children are 7 sons and 3 daughters.
Okay. If we had lots of time, I'd have you tell me about that.
Yeah. Sometime, if we have time at the end, maybe we can get back to that.
Okay.
One further question. Do you only have one wife?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. One wife. And at one point in his misery, his wife tells him, just curse God and die. that was her input into his situation.
Hey, Steve.
Yeah.
I heard one time that this is considered the oldest written book in the Bible. Can you verify that one way or the other?
Well, in its current form, it is not the oldest book in the Bible, but as we'll get into a little bit later, there are literary forerunners to this story that go all the way back to the 3rd millennium BCE in Egypt. Similar stories that maybe was the spark for the author of Job creating this work.
Thank you.
Point 3, there's a young man named Elihu. He appears late in the story, and I'll say more about that later. Point 4, there of course is God. One interesting thing is that the author of one of these books, I think it's Greenstein, does not translate the Hebrew words used for God, because God to us, we have our theology sort of emphasizes God is good, the devil is bad. They didn't have that concept back then. Everything came from God. So in order to avoid the inference that this is a good God, he just uses the Hebrew terms. Yahweh, Shaddai, El, Eloah, Elohim, the different Hebrew words for God. Point 5, the Satan, and the article in front there is on purpose. In the Hebrew, the word means the accuser. Satan, we think of as sort of the name of the devil. The Satan back then was not what we think of as the devil. Among the heavenly court, God had the idea that this was like a kingdom, court kingdom, and in the heavenly court there was a prosecutor, and that's the accuser. Apparently, they thought it was the accuser's job to prosecute sinners before God's judgment. So that's what we mean about the Satan or the accuser.
The beginning of jurisprudence then, huh?
Yes, right. Sometimes when we look back at these old works through the lens of Christianity, we can get the wrong idea about what's going on. So I'm going to try to point out those places where their theology was different than ours. Let's talk about any questions so far. I should stop once in a while and see if anybody has anything to ask. Okay, let's talk about the structure of the book. This book is divided up into 5 sections, very unequal sections. Some of them are tiny and some of them are huge. The first section is the prologue, chapters 1 and 2. It's written in prose, and possibly along with the epilogue, it comes from an ancient folk tale. More about that later. In this section, we learn about the characters and the reason for Job's misery. God asks the Satan where he has been, and the Satan says, "Oh, I've been going to and fro on the earth," and presumably to watch for sinners that he should prosecute. God said, "Oh, well, have you run across my servant Job, a very righteous man?" And the Satan says, "Well, of course he's righteous. You've given him all these blessings. I'll bet if he didn't have these blessings, he wouldn't be so faithful." And God said, "You're on." So this is kind of like a perverse bet between God and Satan, although there's no wager. Maybe it was just bragging rights that they were trying to claim, but if, for whatever reason, God said, "Okay, do your worst, but don't harm Job." And so the Satan caused Job's 10 children to die. He lost all of his cattle and sheep and his property. And that's how Job gets into this predicament, is because of this difference of opinion between God and the Satan. The next section.
God, though, right?
Pardon?
That's pretty mean of God, isn't it?
Yeah. It seems like Job is just caught in the middle here. And if you look, people who are looking for the answer to the question, why do bad things happen to good people? They look at that and it seems just so arbitrary. There is not a good answer to that question in the book of Job. But still, there are some good points that we can get out of the book. And at the end, I'll go into that a little bit more. But yes, it seems awfully cruel of God to put Job through this. The second section is dialogue or symposium. I almost hate to call it a dialogue because they're not really engaging in give and take. They're stating their points of view, which get more set in concrete as the dialogue goes along. It's not much of a debate, unless you think of a good debate as our presidential debates, and it was kind of like that. Basically 2 people shouting at each other, or rather, this is 4 people. It's Job against his 3 friends. So they debate the cause of his afflictions. The friends are fans of the theory that God's judgment is always just. So if Job is suffering, he must have done something to deserve his suffering. Job, of course, has no idea how. I mean, Job is not, in the prologue, we get a peek behind the curtain, right, in this controversy between God and the Satan. Job doesn't know anything about that. All he knows is he's suffering and he doesn't know why. So Job is maintaining that this isn't just. Job, there are cycles of dialogue in this section. Job speaks, then Job speaks, then Eliphaz speaks, then Job speaks, then Bildad speaks, and Job speaks, then Zophar speaks, and so on through the dialogue. Some verses in this section seem to be out of order. So when we get to the text in those places, I'll try to identify those verses that would make more sense if they were rearranged a little bit. The third section is the Elohim Speeches. Oh, I forgot to say the dialogue is written in poetry. So are the Elohim Speeches. Elihu is a young man who weighs in on this argument late in the game after Job and his 3 friends are finished. And Job sort of signs off, signs his name and says, okay, God, what do you have to say for yourself? But instead of God speaking right away, we have these chapters 32 through 37 where this young man, Elihu, tries to do what the three friends were unable to do, and that's convince Job that there's some reason he deserves his misery and he should just repent and ask for God's mercy, and then things will turn around. The placement of this section is problematic because, well, like I said, the story is essentially over except for God's take on it. And here's Elihu's speeches put right there in the middle. On the other hand, where is this later editor, where was he going to put it? He couldn't put it at the end of the book because that would be after God speaks, and God's got to have the last word in this story. So the arrangement is problematic. So the placement is, it is what it is. Then, starting with chapter 38, we have what's called the theophany. That's God's appearance in this game. This section is also written in poetry. The voice of God comes out of a whirlwind, and God makes the case that Job is not a god. So how would Job be expected to answer that question of why? To me, this speech, God speaks twice actually in this section, and these speeches by God sound a lot like what God said to Jonah in the book of Jonah, right? Jonah goes out and the worst has happened as far as he's concerned. He preached to the people of Nineveh and they repented. So the evil people of Nineveh are going to be saved, and Job hates that. I mean, Jonah hates that. So he goes out and sulks, and eventually God says, now listen, Job, I'm God. Can't I make a tree grow up and a tree die? Can't I save who I want to save? And the speeches of God to Job are sort of similar to that. God asks Job, were you around when I created the world? That's the argument that God makes, is that Job really should have no expectations about being able to understand how the world works. Finally, the last few verses of chapter 42, an epilogue. This is written in prose. And in this section, Job's fortunes are restored. He gets his property back. He has 10 more children, 7 boys and 3 girls, and everything is put right again. Now, again, you have to ask, it's pretty cruel of God to let his first 10 children be killed. I mean, where's justice for those children that died, right? But he gets 10 more children back in any case at the end of the book.
Maybe the second 10 are better behaved, perhaps.
Yeah, could be. There is an indication.
Less partying.
Pardon me?
Less partying.
Yes, less partying. That's right. We'll get into that when we get into the text. His first children apparently took turns having parties. At least these are adult children, right? And the young men take turns having parties, and they invite their sisters over, and Job is continually having to sort of make amends for his kids' behavior. Any other questions or comments at this point?
Well, Steve?
Yeah.
I've read the book of Job a couple times before in the past, and one question, and maybe you'll answer this over the course of the fall semester, is it's not so much a question of whether God has allowed this, but there are certain translations that I've read where God actually takes credit for doing this. Sometimes it's hard to tell whether Satan's the cause of it or God's the cause of it. So maybe that question will be answered more fully as we go along this fall. But that's been a burning question in my mind for years.
Yeah. Well, at least according to the NRSV translation, God permits the Satan to do these things to Job. But that would be interesting to see a different translation. Maybe I haven't finished either of these two books yet. I'll be going through them as we go along. But maybe one of their translations will give an indication about how to answer that question.
Steve, I have a question.
Yeah.
You said, and I've heard over and over again, that, this, the story of Job is a story, not, it wasn't like a real event like Exodus or something like that. Is that in the fundamentalist religions, Christian religions, is that still true with them, or do they think it really happened?
Well, according to what I've heard, the fundamentalist types believe that all of the Bible is literally true. So I would guess that most of those people think that this is a historical report on something that really happened.
That's what I thought. And then their attitude is often, if something bad happened to you, you do have hidden sin that you should be repenting for. I mean, I've heard that attitude expressed. So yeah.
Although according to the book of Job, Job had no hidden sins. His misery was caused by this argument between God and the Satan.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, following up on Mary's question, Steve, is there a place called the Land of Uz? Is that an historical place? Uz?
Good question. I don't know. I can look that up and report back, but I don't have the answer off the top of my head.
Okay, yeah, I'm not testing you. I'm just kind of curious,
Yeah, no, that's a reasonable question.
Nor do I have the answer off the top of my head. So thanks for looking it up, Steve.
Okay.
It's not Oz, it's Uz, right? It could be
Uz,
Oz.
yes, U-Z, Uz.
Uz, is that close to use? Is Uz close to use? Bad
I'll go
pun,
with
sorry.
Oz.
Let Steve continue.
Okay. Anything else? Before I want to talk about some of these works that are much older than Job, but are similar. But I want to get your questions answered about the summary that I just went through. Anything else? Okay. There's a section in my outline I call literary antecedents. In other words, what has come before. There's an Egyptian text that was discovered. I have the date down here as 2100 BCE. I probably should have said simply toward the end of the third millennium BCE, because having an exact number there, we can't date this text that accurately. So,
Steve,
yes?
I don't understand your phrase third millennium BCE because I get confused. Can you tell me what that means, third millennium BCE?
Oh, yeah. So the first millennium BCE is from 1,000 to 1, right? The years, and the second millennium would be 2,000 to 1,000, and the third millennium would be 3,000 to 2,000.
Okay, so when we say the first century. The first century CE, it doesn't start with one, like the year 150 is not in the first century, right?
Correct.
But the third millennium actually does, the years do start with 3,000?
It would be, well, actually it would be 2,999. Up to, right, so it does not include the year 3000. It would be the 2000s would be the third millennium, and the 1000s would be the second millennium, and the zeros, if you want to call it that, would be the first millennium.
So in a similar manner, the third millennium doesn't start with threes.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
It's the same deal as with centuries.
Got it.
Yeah. So there was an Egyptian text, and this is a story about a debate between a man and his soul as to the expediency of suicide. This man is suffering and wants an escape from his suffering. So he's considering suicide. His soul is against suicide. And they have this debate. And in this story, the man wins in favor of suicide. And the turning point in the argument is when the man says to his soul, but think about how much better things will be beyond the grave, in the afterlife, right? And that convinces the soul. So in this story, the story is resolved with suicide. Now, this is different than the book of Job, of course. Job obviously didn't commit suicide. And in fact, solace in the life beyond was not even available to the author of Job. Back then in Hebrew theology, there was no reward or punishment in the afterlife. There was a place where souls went after you died. It was called Sheol. There's at least one place in the Psalms where Sheol is referred to as the pit. It's apparently was not a very pleasant place to be, not at all. A place of sleep-like existence where you're just cut off from everything. It's not a place where you got together with your friends and family after death. You were asleep by yourself and separated from God as well. So the solace in the life beyond the grave was not something that was available to the author of Job. Point 2, Egyptian tale of the eloquent peasant. This is in the second millennium, toward the beginning of the second millennium. A peasant is mistreated and robbed by a vassal of the chief steward. He is not willing to let justice escape him, so he risks his life by appealing to the chief steward himself. He could have been executed for doing that. But in fact, he received justice. The chief steward agreed with him, and he received justice. Now, the difference here, of course, from Job is that the issue here is social justice, not divine justice. So it's a little bit different in that respect. Point 3, a Sumerian poem. Fragments were excavated at the site Nippur. A man who had been prosperous and healthy is afflicted with disease and pain. Now, of course, this is very much like the book of Job, right? But Job berated his God, and this man pleads for mercy. Apparently, the Sumerians had an idea similar to our original sin. The world was tainted by sin, including human beings, so no one could claim to be completely righteous. If bad things were happening to you, it was because of this taint of sin, and you were supposed to plead to the gods for mercy. Another one I'll mention is an Akkadian. In the Akkadian language, I will praise the Lord of wisdom. This is sometimes called the Babylonian Job. Akkad was a city, a pre-Babylonian city, but in the same areas eventually Babylon would be. This is a thanksgiving hymn for deliverance from mercy. This is after the problem of suffering had been removed from this author. And so this is a thanksgiving hymn. But in this hymn, we learn that the hero is smitten with disease and forsaken by all. Prayers to the god Marduk resulted in healing. These may have been the seeds that the author of Job used when composing his book. Any questions so far? Okay, I have some points to ponder at the end of the outline. This is one of the I think one of the good takeaways we can draw from this book, Job had extraordinary faith in God, but it could also be said that God had extraordinary faith in Job. God trusted that Job would remain faithful through all of this misery. That it's really extraordinary. So the question is, in what ways might the faith between humankind and God be a two-way street? We have faith in God, but also God has faith in humankind. And what does that mean for us today as we go through some of the sufferings that we are going through with COVID-19 and climate change, wildfires, hurricanes, political unrest, racial strife? The list goes on and on these days. So what might we learn from the book of Job about our behavior in the face of God's magnificent faith in humankind?
Wow. That's a double wow, Steve.
You know, it almost seems to be human nature. When we have a hardship, we remember God. When things are going along pretty smoothly, it's like, wow, life is good. And then we get a hardship, and that, in my case, I know it's like, oh, Lord, help me. I remember to pray. So,
yeah. Anybody else? Let's pick out something. Okay, so in Genesis, God has so much faith in humankind that God entrusts the earth to our care. Now, these days, it might seem like that faith was misplaced, but if we can't change the past, so going forward, how does that magnificent faith that God has in us, how should that guide our behavior?
Well, I don't know if it was misplaced. Look at how much we have succeeded at growing food. They tell us that we actually grow enough food to feed everybody, that the reason that people go hungry is that we don't know how to transport it everywhere, and we can't solve the political problems that prevent us from transporting it everywhere. That we actually have the agricultural capability of feeding everyone. So in some ways, we have been spectacularly successful with that aspect of stewarding the earth. Now, we have also produced food in ways like, I think, of factory farming that are horribly cruel and terrible. So we haven't succeeded 100%, but there's both the upside and the downside to how we've stewarded the earth.
Yes.
Up on that point, Steve and Janet, I think your name is within one molecule, there's enough energy to supply the rest of the world's needs for decades and centuries and millenniums to come. It's all there.
Yes.
You could check my nuclear physics, but I think that's true.
I wouldn't doubt it. E equals MC squared, after all.
If we could change it into energy, yes, we don't know how to do that.
Yeah, we don't know how to control such a reaction yet.
To change the subject a little bit, I looked up on Google, was Job a real person? And I found this. Dear Pastor John, I have enjoyed your messages on the book of Job. Recently, I was at a service at my church, and I heard the pastor say that Job was a fictitious character. Pastor John answers, if I heard the pastor make a statement that Job was a fictitious character, I would seriously consider finding another church.
Okay.
So the answer is yes, there are people who think that that statement is a terrible, terrible thing.
Yes, yes. Right.
Steve, I'll still come to your class if everybody else leaves now.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, that's right.
Thank you.
My
Steve the
response-
heretic.
My response is, who are the real characters?
Who aren't fictitious? Yeah. Well, you know, Abraham and Abram, we got two names going there. What's that about? Oh my goodness.
Since we're kind of floating, I wanted to bring this up. When I was in college, way back in the 60s, I saw a play that presented a play, very powerful, called J.B., J period, B period.
Yeah.
It's by Archibald MacLeish. And it's about Job, and he's a 20th century millionaire businessman. And you know, and then at the beginning of the play, God and the devil are up there making this bargain, and it's a very powerful play. So I just thought I don't even know if it's ever being shown again, but
Okay.
Oh yeah, it's a very well-known play, and it's irreverent. It isn't a religious play by any stretch of the imagination, and you have to put up with some foul language.
Isn't Tevye and Fiddler on the Roof, isn't he sort of a Job character?
Is that right?
Well,
Well,
in that case too, with Tevye, you know, he ends up being adjusting. We were talking earlier, bad things can happen to good people and good things can happen to bad people. But that's what's striking in Tevye, when his daughter married, the one daughter, what is it, the third one or whatever, marries a Christian. And it's like he just can't twist his head that far, you know, it's just too far. He adjusts everything else, but that's too much for him. But he's got to deal with it. And of course, he wonders oh, go ahead.
A Job character in the sense that he encounters a lot of suffering. Yes,
Yeah.
but a true Job character is one who encounters a lot of suffering through no fault of his own, and then has everything restored to him, which Tevye does not.
Yeah.
Well, unless there's anything else, we're getting close to the end of our time here. I need to rearrange some technology here at home so Pat and I can attend Zoom worship at 11. Thank you all for coming. Remember the special Reformation Stewardship Program in a week, next Sunday. So the next class on Job will be 2 weeks from today.
And if you didn't catch it, Andy was here earlier, but he was asked made one of the comments early on. That's who will be teaching next week with a stewardship emphasis. So I really encourage you to participate in that.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Steve.
Appreciate it.